poem is about our community, the Romanian diaspora. I feel very special that I'm a member of this elite group, but we do have our eccentricities. And so this poem is about how I feel being a member of this community. It's called A Tricky Diaspora. I'm from a tricky diaspora, an assimilate quick diaspora, a red lipstick, high heels, and skinny perfume cigarettes diaspora. The only thing we are known for is not exactly in our history. Dracula, diaspora. Maybe that's why we always say we're from anywhere that we actually are from. Je suis à Paris. I can't actually hear the parental accents in diaspora. My siblings cannot pronounce our family name correctly. Diaspora. A too suspicious, yet too trusting diaspora. Shh, don't talk, or they'll hear you. Diaspora. A country that you've never heard of. Diaspora. And I silently understand 8 languages. Diaspora. A no pressure to get married ever. Diaspora. Us sex is healthy and beautiful. Diaspora. And any race is more beautiful than Caucasian. Diaspora. Unless you're a Roma gypsy. Diaspora. A politically totally confused diaspora. A Reagan, realpolitik diaspora. So you're telling me that all healthcare isn't free? Diaspora? All education always on full scholarship in diaspora? What? You don't already have 2 graduate degrees? Doctor. Diaspora. A knowing the world map. Diaspora. A spiritual, but not religious. Diaspora. A never knowing your grandparents. Diaspora. A family history so painful that you just never talk about it. Diaspora. A rejoicing through tears when your country's dictator is assassinated. Diaspora. A real appreciation for a pair of blue jeans. Diaspora. A not so ancient history of wearing denim on denim. Diaspora. A deep understanding of the origins of rock and roll. Diaspora. Ce frumoasă țară e Romania. Is it? Dar în SUA avem un viitor. You don't have to be from our diaspora to have heard that one before. So the title of the book, of course, Green Horses on the Walls, is a very famous saying in Romanian. I'm sure that many in the audience heard it a lot growing up or have said it a lot to their kids. And this poem is in honor of being raised by a Romanian and navigating that as we are all in the American rat race. And at the same time trying to balance, shall we say, our passions. And of course, I named the book after this poem. And while I have the book, I should clarify that my Romanian grandparents, so Anca, BEJAN, and Mariwara, forgive me, BEJAN, and this is my grandmother's younger brother. They're walking through Cismigiu Park in around like the late 1930s because they met as college sweethearts in Bucharest. They were the first in their families to go to college. So this is a very special photo to me, and I was so excited that I was able to have it grace the cover of my debut poetry collection. So, green horses on the walls. Here we go. Green horses on the walls. Asta a fost la început în mintea mea. Visurile mele n-au fost posibile. Am fost nebună, bătută în cap. Cristina, pisă de masă. Cristina, vrei doar că vezi pe pereți. Green horses on the walls. The Romanian expression for having delusions. From the start, I was told that my dreams weren't possible, that I was crazy, that theater was only a hobby, that I was merely chasing the green horses and it was time to grow up because they didn't exist. Well, I know I need to write exists. I know that the open page is a reservoir for my joy and pain. I know that the sweat-stained floors of an empty theater welcome me. I also know that my dimensions cannot be confined to a DCCB, a list of degrees and honors. Now perhaps those don't truly exist. Can they capture a beating heart, prayers, kindness, or caring for our elders and children? Or the next play that's on the tip of my pen and igniting my mind with excitement? The straitjacketed list to DC Impress is what confines and lies. My truth is displayed on the open canvas of my art. My truth runs with the green horses through the fields, down Rockville Pike, and all the way to the heart of DC, 14th Street. I hear them calling, Cristina, hai a casa, calling me home. As I walk today through a canopy of trees, I cross paths with a butterfly, and I came home to write this poem, and neither were or are delusions. Ca vezi pe pereți, a durat 34 de ani pentru mine să știu adânc în inima mea că sunt exact cum m-am creat și a vrut Dumnezeu. Și pentru asta sunt pur și simplu mulțumită. We have one more. I write a lot about the crimes of communism. This is a part of our community's history that I believe we need to talk more about. Of course, not just to be educated, but to try to prevent similar crimes of humanity happening again, no matter where we are in the world. So both of my father's parents, who you saw on the cover of the book, were imprisoned during the communist regime, and my father's uncle was interned on the Canal labor camp for 10 years. And I know so many of us have these stories, and as I said, we need to not only educate the public, but we need to tell our children so they can tell their children, and this oral history, this knowledge will forever be remembered. We cannot forget what happened to Romania. So this poem, there are quite a few about communism in the book, and I should say crimes of communism. This poem is about how communism destroys families. It's called Nu e rolul meu. We sat across from each other in this Camden pub, both blonde, both 5'5". One is a professional model. Guess which? The other, a roving intellectual. The last time I saw Mihaela was in a photograph. Black and white. She was brunette then and very tiny. Wearing an ie, you know, the traditional Romanian blouse, and she was sitting next to Moș Crăciun, Galaț's Santa Claus. You know, Chris, you were my Neverland. Am zis că am știut, pentru că ea a fost la fel pentru mine. I lived for the next box of toys and clothes, for our grandmother to return from a trip and tell me of you guys. Through photographs, you, Anna, and Gabi were my family. I'm not close to my parents, you know. But when bunica noastră died, it all stopped. No more contact from you. And no one ever told me why. I asked my father over and over again and nothing. Our fathers are different, I told her. Mine, serious. Yours, the family rebel. And at that moment, I had the chance to tell her. But she seemed so happy. So I decided that nu e rolul meu. It is not my role to tell her that I had been told. Her parents tried to starve our grandmother to death for her apartment. It was 1994. Property had just been returned to Romanians by the state. They locked her in hers. A 90-year-old woman with Alzheimer's and deformed hands from a lifetime of filling medicine bottles as a pharmacist. My father only found out because a Galat's friend got wind of the terror and called him in North Carolina. I was 12, my sister was 10, and our brother was 4. And our American grandfather had been dead for 2 years. I know now that we forgive family, but that doesn't mean that we have to discuss everything. Mihaela and I are friends now. Și nu e rolul meu. Thank you for watching. Thank you for having me, Ichere. Please visit Bucharest Inside the Beltway, Facebook and Instagram for the very, very latest updates, and contact us directly if you want to get involved, either as an artist or a cultural promoter. Thank you so much. Vă mulțumesc frumos tuturor.
Hello, I'm Alta Ifland, and I will talk today about a concept that has been very present in the past year or so on the minds of many American writers. It's called cultural appropriation, but I will talk about it in a way that is different than the way it's currently discussed in the United States. So those of you who are familiar with the term know that it's being used mostly in discussions related to so-called appropriation by white writers from so-called brown or black writers, and so it's talked about in relation to literature, but only in relation to racial tensions, which is kind of absurd, because if you talk about cultural appropriation, it should apply to everything that represents culture and everything that represents appropriation. So I should say that current racial tensions are obviously very real in the United States. It's a very serious issue, and these tensions should be dealt with. They should be dealt with in real life, and not by redefining a whole concept of literature, because literature is something that is universal. And when you redefine a whole concept of literature according to specific American problems, you are creating a big problem. So I would also say that literature is in its very essence cultural appropriation, because literature only exists in dialogue with other works of literature, and the better a work of literature is, the more it quotes or it makes references to other works of literature. Some of you may be familiar with the concept of intertextuality, which means that every text of literature incorporates texts or references from other works of art. So really, literature cannot even exist, and you cannot talk about literature outside of cultural appropriation, because it's all made of appropriation. And in fact, if you really think about it, we all are appropriation in our being. None of us is some kind of a bubble separated from the others. Any single culture is a culture of appropriation. So I would like to take this discussion even in another direction. Well, by saying, first of all, that if one were to really apply the concept of cultural appropriation to the whole of literature, one would have to really, literature itself would have to disappear, because literature cannot exist outside of cultural appropriation. So to make this, to see how absurd this is, let me take my own situation as a writer. How do you define cultural appropriation when you are talking about a writer who had to leave her home country, her country of birth, and emigrate for political reasons or for economic reasons, for that matter? Anybody could emigrate for whatever reasons. I'm not in an extremely special situation. There are many writers like me today. So how do you define cultural appropriation in the case of a writer who leaves her home country and then emigrates to another country, and then she is literally forced to appropriate the language, not only the culture, but she has to start with the language of her new country? And in fact, somebody like me was forced to appropriate two languages, because first I got a degree in French, and I started to write as a writer in French because I couldn't write in English. When I came to this country, my English was very, very poor. I already had a bachelor in French, and so then I got a PhD in French. And at some point, I became a French writer. I was able to write almost like a French person. And actually, my first book of creative writing was in French, a book of prose poems, and it got an important French prize. So basically, I had to become a writer, because I was never a writer in Romanian language, even though that language is probably the language I master best. Or actually, to be honest, at this point, I can't say that I have a native language at this point, because I lost the mastery of Romanian, and obviously no matter how much I perfect my English, English is not my native language, and neither is French. So basically, I had to appropriate two cultures and two languages. And believe me, this is for Americans out there, believe me, it's not easy to appropriate. It's actually very, very difficult. So yeah, how do you define cultural appropriation for these writers? For writers like me, who are in themselves a monument to cultural appropriation, how do you define cultural appropriation for these writers? I'm afraid that most Americans would never address these questions, because American writers never have to imagine that they have to emigrate. At least they didn't have to imagine until now. I have a feeling that things are going to change from now on. Still, even if American writers and Americans in general emigrate, they never have to change their language. And this is essential. They never have to change their language, because everybody speaks their language. So they never have to imagine what it actually means to do the most difficult act of appropriation, and actually one of the hardest things that you can do in your life, to learn a foreign language. Because in order to learn a foreign language like your own, that actually is an impossibility. You can't do that. You can do it because you cannot reinvent your childhood, because language is also, we associate language with times in our lives. So if you didn't learn a language as a child, you don't have that association. So you can never learn a language like a native person. So Americans never have to change their language. They never have to appropriate another language. They have the luxury, the privilege of not doing this. But most of the world doesn't have this luxury. I didn't have this luxury. I had to appropriate. And as I said, you try to appropriate another language and then we'll talk. Yes. For the rest of the world, a writer is no longer a representative of a nation or even a language, never mind an ethnic or racial group. It used to be that Dante equaled Italy, equaled Italian language. It used to be that Shakespeare equaled England, equaled English language. Goethe equaled Germany, equaled German language. Eminescu equaled Romania, equaled Romanian language. But this has changed. This is no longer true. Now there are writers like Yoko Tawada, who can equal both Japan and Germany. Alexander Hammond, who can equal both Bosnia and the United States. Yun Li, both China and the United States. This is evident to the entire world, except the United States. While on the rest of the planet, the vision of literature has progressed from a local space, that of the nation, to a global one, that of the entire world, in the United States, the reverse has been happening. Now it is considered unacceptable to take on other identities than that of your own ethnic or racial group. This phenomenon, which is framed as progressive or part of some kind of progressive ideology, is in fact extremely regressive. And I'm afraid it is part of the same tribalism that has taken over the American society. Or maybe not quite the same tribalism, but another type of tribalism, because basically we are now being caught between two types of tribalism, one from the right side of the political spectrum and another one from the left side of the political spectrum. Two types of tribalism, both dangerous. So, when Flaubert wrote in 19th century Madame Bovary, and not, I don't know, let's say The Scarlet Letter or any other book that he could have written, he didn't do this because he thought it was morally wrong for a Frenchman to write about another country or about another society. He didn't do it because it would have simply been ridiculous for him to write about something that he didn't have experience with, that something that he didn't really master in a serious and deep way. So, to bring this to our discussion about cultural appropriation, writers have the freedom to identify with whomever they want. You can be a Frenchman and write about an American, if you want so, or a Romanian and write about a Frenchman. You have this freedom. But at the same time, you have limitations, and these limitations are simply the limits of your imagination. There are things that you won't be able to do properly because human imagination has limits. And no matter how great your imagination is, it's still based on reality. And if you don't have an experience, obviously, the description of that reality is going to be problematic. But this doesn't mean that you shouldn't try to do it or that somebody should forbid you doing this. These are two very different things. So the truth is that no human being can really fully understand another human being. This is an existential impossibility. But this impossibility doesn't mean that we shouldn't do it. How, and just as importantly, why we do it, should then be the question. Thank you.